It gives me great pleasure to introduce to you our guest speaker, Vincent Ialenti. Dr. Ialenti, henceforth referred to as Vincent, is an assistant research professor at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs and MacArthur postdoctoral fellow at the University of British Columbia's School of Public Policy and Global Affairs. He's also an expert on nuclear waste management and the author of Deep Time Reckoning, a book that has made Finnish nuclear industry famous beyond an anthropological audience. It's also a book that has been made famous by the Finnish press and so forth. You might have read about it in the news. Vincent has also published his work in journals such as Social Studies of Science and the Journal of the Royal Anthropological Institute and so forth. But many of us in Finland, and particularly in Helsinki Anthropology, also know Vincent from the time he was based in Helsinki while conducting field research on the Finnish nuclear industry. For a number of years, I've been particularly fond of recounting the story of the discovery of Vincent Ialenti by my Helsinki colleagues in a bar. In short, they spotted a stranger with a Roy Wagner book, and since only anthropologists would have such a book, they went and chatted him up. And since then, Vincent has participated in various events and discussions organized by us, that is the Finnish Anthropological Society, for instance, 2 Suomen anthropology forums. So I'm happy to welcome Vincent back, even if it's just virtual Finland. And the title of his talk today will be Deep Time Reckoning, Infinition Futurity among Finland's nuclear waste experts. So ole hyvä, Vincent, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, hello. Hello again to many of you I already know. And thanks for having me. I'm really grateful to Mari for the introduction, also to Matti for this generous introduction. And as mentioned, I spent 32 months conducting ethnographic fieldwork in Finland from 2012 to 2014. I recorded 120 interviews with geologists and managers, chemists, physicists, lawyers, engineers, politicians, regulators, activists, banking professionals, and members of the public in Finland. And my goal when I was there was to explore how Finland's nuclear, Olkiluoto nuclear waste repository safety case experts specifically reckoned with deep geological timescales. And last September, MIT Press released the book Matti mentioned titled Deep Time Reckoning. So what's in the book? Well, it explores how Finland's nuclear waste community folded these kind of sequences of scenarios and hopes and calculations, fears, data sets, dreams, models, and anxieties about Finland's socio-ecological futures, near and distant, into these really mundane and boring artifacts of technocratic paperwork. The book, it's an experiment with genre. It's partially an ethnographic study. It's partially a how-to guide for expanding the reader's temporal awareness. And it's partially a call to action for short-sighted societies facing down a looming global ecological crisis. So nurturing public time literacy, the book argues, is increasingly vital as today's Anthropocene ecological downturn is complicated by a deflation of popular enthusiasm, which is in the United States for liberal arts education. And there's also this institutional erosion of expert authority that's happened throughout the Trump administration in the US and elsewhere. So while doing fieldwork in Finland, my interest was in the everyday work lives of the uniquely long-sighted nuclear waste repository safety case expert. So these experts developed models of geological, hydrological, and ecological events that could potentially occur in Western Finland over the coming tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of years. The safety case experts routinely reckoned with distant future glaciations and climate changes and earthquakes, floods, human animal population changes, and more. Their goal was to develop a portfolio of technical evidence supporting Finland's nuclear industry's license application for a government permit to begin formal construction of this repository they're building. The repository is going to be located 450 meters underground in the island of Olkiluoto in the Gulf of Bothnia and the Baltic Sea. And Finland's nuclear regulatory authority, STUK, approved the safety case in 2015. Soon after, Finland's Ministry of Employment and the Economy issued the Finnish nuclear waste management company Posiva its construction license to officially call it a repository, even though a lot of it's already been built. It was previously legally called a laboratory. So this made Finland the first country in the world to get to this stage of licensing a spent nuclear fuel repository. And sometime in the next few years, this Olkiluoto repository is going to begin accepting spent fuel. Now, critical social scientists like me have usually been quick to brush off these long-term repository safety assessment models as reductive constructions or epistemic oversimplifications. The reason they do that is because they are. They have a major point because predicting distant futures is an impossible task. However, as an anthropologist, I see my job as trying to peek inside my informants' worldviews and critically apprehend their thinking's internal logics, no matter how irrational they may initially seem. And early on in this thought experiment of trying to see these constructions through their eyes, something became increasingly clear to me over the 2.5 years. Most of my fieldwork informants pretty much agreed with me that their task is totally impossible. They had a more subtle epistemic sensibility than I'd been led to believe. They saw it as sort of obvious that the models are reductive or subjective or significantly mediated by history and culture. That was something they often volunteered to me when I said this, perhaps because I was an anthropologist and they felt like they should say that to an anthropologist, but it was acknowledged nonetheless. So they saw their hyperconstructions of far future Finlands as highly sophisticated, educated guesses, and they're simply the most credible forecast they could devise using the best science and technology made available to them by their bosses. So I decided in my book to take a collaborative approach and take these pragmatic futurologies seriously and even stretch them a little bit. So my goal isn't to advocate for any naive realism or scientism or positivism in reckoning the far future. We obviously can't backslide into what Malinowski once called the cult of the pure fact. And I don't advocate for or against nuclear energy either. I totally avoid that question in the book. I simply argue that the safety case experts' mission of embarking on these distant future modeling projects in this kind of self-critical spirit can inform our current moment of global ecological devastation. When looking deep time in the eye, the safety case experts adopted an outlook of what Emmanuel Levinas once called infinition. It's a cognitive state in which radical complexity is kind of allowed to overflow the thought that tries to think it. And this constant engagement with radical complexity and unthinkable, ungraspable complexity made the safety case experts quite comfortable with extreme ambiguity. So with that epistemic sensibility in view, my book asks how ethnographic methods can be used to kind of mine safety case expertise for pragmatic strategies that experts and publics alike can adopt to become more skilled deep time reckoners, also time reckoners. And I call the strategies in my book reckonings, and each chapter ends with 5 or 6 of them. They're kind of these little threads of takeaway guidance or brainstorming pathways I propose, kind of spinning off elements of thinking from the safety case experts as I follow them into their version of far future Finlands in the plural. So this, I argue, can help contemporary societies resist 2 of today's most dismal global crises. The first is the Anthropocene. It's a name proposed for a troubled epoch in Earth's history. It's ushered in by human transformations of our planet's climate, erosion patterns, extinctions, atmosphere, rock record, and more. We should, of course, be quite skeptical of misuses of the Anthropocene term. Any Anthropocene theorization that lumps humanity's culpability for environmental crisis into a single undifferentiated species-wide mass is quite wrong. Obviously, some of the person who invented this, the industrialist who invented the steam engine, or you know the Manhattan Project, which ended up releasing large amounts of radionuclides, man-made radionuclides across Earth's surface. These people have a much greater culpability in ushering in the Anthropocene and environmental destruction than someone who lived in a small village as a carpenter their whole life without access to all these tools. So, however, the Anthropocene as a concept, I think, can be quite useful for challenging people to reimagine their ways of thinking, acting, and dwelling to better sync up with Earth's radical long-term. So a second crisis is creating new obstacles to achieving this more robust time literacy. My book, I call it The Deflation of Expertise. And over the past few years in the United States and Western Europe and beyond, political power has been increasingly gained through this kind of nationalist populist mockery of virtues of meticulousness and cautious speech. So that's the thing that the book kind of defends: meticulousness and cautious speech as expert virtues. So vaccine science, stem cell research, climate change models, ballot counts, critical social theories, cell phone radiation studies, pandemic disease alerts, human evolution research. These things have all been routinely attacked in these frenzied cable news free-for-alls in the US and social media echo chambers. 2016 Oxford English Dictionary names post-truth its word of the year. Alternative fact and fake news are now mainstream buzzwords, though they're used by different groups in different ways. And in this setting, on this side of the pond, it strikes a different chord when social theorists critique the hegemony of realism, truth, and facthood. These same analytical strategies are frequently used now by nationalist populists trying to sow doubt about climate change models and coronavirus epidemiological models. This used to be mostly the province of the left-leaning academics in the 70s. Now it's been frequently appropriated by Steve Bannon types in the United States. So social theoretical notions like, for example, Foucault's notion of power knowledge, they remain vital and important and descriptive, but they resonate a little differently now. In Trump's America, political power was not necessarily always gained through alliance with technocratic knowledge, though it was sometimes. It was often gained by sort of jazzing up crowds through charismatic performative mockery of it at rallies. So it goes a little deeper than this too, because increasingly expert voices in the US and elsewhere are drowned out by Twitter mobs. They're dulled by corporate knowledge management red tape. They're exhausted by adjunctification hiring trends at universities, the rise of these bloated and costly university administrative infrastructures that are run by MBAs. They're warped by these short-term contingent gig economy research funding contracts. They're rushed by publish or perish productivity pressures. And with these slow-moving, long-sighted expert inquiries kind of receding from view, societies enter into this state of futurelessness, which is quite scary. So there's this manic fixation on the present moment that incessantly shoots down proposals for envisioning better worlds. So the book argues that today, looking Earth's radical long-term in the eye is a pressing societal task, and lots of people need better tools to do it. So that's why I wrote Deep Time Reckoning in this strange, accessible genre. My home country has been shaken by fractious social division, unraveling trust between experts and lay people. The last thing we need is yet another alienating academic tome, hiding its best ideas behind impenetrable jargons. What's needed are more stable bridges and points of connection between the social and natural sciences, between experts, non-experts, and diverse cultures inhabiting a damaged planet that for too many people feels less and less like a friendly global village each day. So in this spirit, the book asks, can collaborative engagement with the safety case experts help resist this epistemic, political, and ecological crisis? Well, to answer this question, I had to examine which aspects of Finnish society were seen as laying groundwork for Finnish experts to make these ambitious journeys across time without caving to onslaughts of public criticism. But what did I find? Well, first I'll say, of course, that any society is likely to look quite different from the perspective of an outsider versus that of an insider. Different ethnographer would see Finland a bit differently. And I certainly don't feel like it's my role to tell an audience of Finns, let alone card-carrying Finnish anthropologists, what exactly makes Finland tick. However, I did write about this issue, even though it wasn't a central theme of my book. My book is not a structural study of Finnishness, for example, or it's not even really an analysis of Finnish governmentality broadly construed. It's this case study about long-termism in the Anthropocene. But I can report on the certain aspects of this that I broached in my book. So In the book, I mostly contrast my own experience of Finnish governmentality, expertise culture, and my experiences with Finnish societal trust, as well as my informant's invocations of Finnish societal trust. They're two different things. With the rise of Trumpism that I witnessed upon returning home in August 2014. So, during fieldwork, Finns from many walks of life kept telling me about their country's warmth to centralized hierarchical institutions such as nuclear power plants, public transport systems, government ministries, and the welfare state. Some pointed to polls casting Finland as unique in the high levels of trust. It placed in domestic civil servants, we would call them technocrats or bureaucrats, in a not pleasant way. Over here, researchers, police, educators, pilots, and engineers. Others pointed to Finland's lack of historical experience with domestic techno-scientific disasters like BP oil spill or Bhopal, though the Chernobyl cloud was not a domestic disaster, but of course came to northern Finland. Finnish social scientists told me of Finland's trust in technology's ability to produce welfare, strong position of administrative bodies, and the historical involvement of academic intellectuals in creating Finnish national ideologies. I'll add that the notion of Finnish societal trust was also a trope that was mobilized in Finland's national branding campaigns. When I was there, it was Alexander Stubb's Brand Finland delegation, as well as Finland's nuclear industry's explanations to the BBC when it was interviewed for why there's not very much not in my backyard politicking around the Olkiluoto repository. So at the end of the day, technocrats at the Ministry of Employment and the Economy, which oversees all of Finland's nuclear sector. In the US, it's the Department of Energy, formerly the Atomic Energy Commission, one of the least trusted organizations. They have a whole grisly history of doing plutonium experimentation on unwitting populations. Atmospheric testing that contaminated, exposed every living piece of human tissue, every living person on Earth to radioactive fallout. In Finland, it's all underneath the Ministry of Employment and the Economy, which is one of the more trusted, when I was there anyway, organizations in the country. Compare that to the US, where technocrat is a four-letter word. So that's not to say there wasn't domestic critique or anti-nuclear activism. I've heard frequent critiques of Finland's icon of the virtually infallible engineer. Others criticized their compatriots for uncritically embracing Enlightenment scientism and the dictates of state authorities. There were demonstrations like the Olkiluoto blockades, activists blocked roads surrounding the Olkiluoto nuclear power plant. 2010, Greenpeace placed a monument of selfishness in a Helsinki park, listed all the names of the parliament members who recently voted for expanding Finland's nuclear capacity, recently then, now it's quite a while ago. In 1980, the Finnish rock band Epu Normaali wrote an ironic song you probably have heard called Suomi Ilmiö, the Finnish Syndrome, which criticized Finns' culture of nuclear trust, though I'm frequently reminded that some members of Epu Normaali, band members, became pro-nuclear later in life and supposedly regret the song. So it's mixed within the group. So anyway, the safety case work remained comparatively non-politicized when you look to other countries. The NIMBY politicking that stopped the US Yucca Mountain Repository project in its tracks in 2009 simply wasn't present in Finland to the same degree. Finland did not see the stagnations that have been seen in France, the UK, and Canada, and Germany, Switzerland, or elsewhere. And they basically held to the repository construction schedule that Finland set in the early 1980s. When I was in Finland, everyone told me how punctual the Finns are. I did not make that connection in the book, but they did keep to this odd schedule in 1982 that they set. The US is decades off from the repository schedule they set. So let's not idealize Finnish expertise culture too much, though. In my book, I talk about a humanities colleague lamenting Finland's consensus valorizing debate culture, making for boring, non-adversarial talk radio, deflating healthy societal critique. Another Finnish social scientist once told me hyperbolically, quote, "In Finland, you get to observe a near total embrace of Foucauldian discipline and governmentality." Certain aspects of the deflation of expertise were alive in Finland too. When I was there, Finland's Talvivaara mine wastewater leaks were known for spreading nickel and cadmium and zinc and uranium and aluminum into Eastern Finland's ecosystem since 2012. There's this high-profile criminal case that followed it caused many to wonder if Finland's domestic extractive industry really works in their interests. Problem goes a little deeper, this deflation of expertise issue. A scientist at the VTG Technical Research Center lamented how expertise in Finland is increasingly diluted by the private interest of commercial and investment capital, constant incessant metrics and workplace audits of research deliverables, and worried that it was happening at the Finnish Meteorological Institute as well. A scientist at Finland's Geological Survey kept telling me how Finland's experts increasingly wasted time doing paperwork, reporting to non-scientist managers who are paid more than them. And when there's an economic downturn, the managers stay in power, and then all the academics, scientists or researchers, they're the ones who lose their jobs. So there are frequent critiques of how they're constantly applying for funding at the Geological Survey now rather than doing actual research. Humanities scholars, when I was there, worried about downsizing, increasingly precarious job markets, and I've heard more recently about universities' interest in owning the rights to research data, which is something that's happening over here too. Now, when I started doing fieldwork, I owned my interviews. I own my interviews for this, but for my new projects I'm starting, it looks like my university will own my research data in the coming years, if, you know, hopefully things change course. So anyway, none of this compared to this affect around this was kind of muted compared to when I returned to the US. I see the precursors to Trumpism. This kind of puts Finnish expertise politics into perspective. I became increasingly optimistic that the safety case experts' spirit of pragmatism, long-termism, and self-critique can offer some, but not total amount of guidance in embracing deep time thinking. So I asked, can anthropological engagement with them help short-sighted societies widen their intellectual time horizons during a moment of global ecological destruction? Can taking their worldviews seriously help publics resist this deflating expertise? Well, let's take an ethnographic field trip into far future Finlands and then see what that has to show us. So what's the safety case? It reports this repository's technical design. It reports engineering principles and strategies. It has all these interwoven quantitative models, qualitative scenarios, forecasting the underground facility's fate over the coming millennia. In my book, I explore how safety case biosphere assessment experts made these projections of Western Finland's lakes and rivers, mires and forests sprouting up, disappearing, changing shape and size over the next 10 millennia. The experts considered far future soil erosion, floods, and fires. They envisioned a 3-kilometer thick glacial ice sheet during the next ice age, slated to occur 50 or 60,000 years from now. They envisioned potential seismic events, earthquakes and rock shears that could occur as the ice sheet retreats after the next ice age. They model how the current Olkiluoto Island site, even though it's more of an islet, a tiny little islet that's barely an island, will eventually become an inland site. In their models, a glacial rebound from the last ice age eventually causes Finland's shoreline to widen further in the Baltic Sea, into the Baltic Sea, and it eventually engulfs the Olkiluoto islet or island into Finland's mainland. They have to model all of this. They also explore more pessimistic and unlikely scenarios. These include models of how 14 different kinds of radionuclides could conceivably escape from this repository's engineered barriers in the far future, travel up through groundwater flows in the underground rock fractures in the bedrock, get released at various points on Earth's surface, and then kind of disperse around in above ground ecosystems, bioaccumulating at times in plants along the way, and animals along the way too, and hopefully not ending up on dinner tables. So I explore how safety case biosphere assessors made these conservative assumptions that 6,000 far future people, all eating local food, will live in Western Finland. My informants' models suggest that some of them, a critical group, are going to face a greater likelihood of exposure due to really picking the wrong food. And I note how all of these hypothetical future people are thought to be safely below stringent regulatory dose limits, even under these very unlikely circumstances. You know, the safety case is an artifact of what Sheila Jasanoff calls regulatory science. So its goal is to persuade quite explicitly. So persuade, no one thought that the safety case is gonna rule that there PostTruth safety case is going to rule that PostTruth's repository should not pass regulatory muster. Everyone knew it would. So these are Promethean labors, right? But reckoning with deep time requires a level of humility too. So safety case experts, to their credit, I haven't seen this in the US or other countries that have robust repository programs. They integrate self-critique and admissions of vast uncertainty into their own models and reports. They have this whole report called Knowledge Quality Assessment, which kind of critiques their epistemic shortcomings. Sensitivity analysis is another one where they try to gauge their gaps in knowledge and then see how sensitive they are to the overall model. It kind of is the spirit of admitting to and systematically detailing various reductive assumptions found in your knowledge base rather than trying to conceal them or cover them up. So the safety case doesn't put forth this one single overconfident model that's assumed to perfectly represent the far future, though this performance assessment model they had was kind of the main one. It forecasts this multiplicitous series of projections about all these potential future events, and they're each kind of weighted towards different likelihoods of occurring, right? So some put forth these base cases or most likely scenarios, then variant cases, reasonably likely scenarios, disturbance, quite unlikely scenarios. In other reports, it's a reference case, most likely, sensitivity case, some negative future variant events are in there, and then these what if cases, which are unlikely worst case scenarios. The one that they really fought over was the disappearing canister scenario, where they made a model of all of a sudden one day a nuclear waste canister just suddenly disappears. And there's not much realism to that happening instantaneously, but it was kind of a point of contention among the modelers. So as my informants saw it, these multiple parallel visions of tomorrow can tell us something, but surely not everything about far future Finlands. This is a multi-temporal, multi-perspectival sensibility, and I kind of extract little kernels of deep time thinking from it to form these end of chapter reckonings. One is about what my informants called multiple lines of evolution. It's about always venturing several multi-pronged visions of potential future worlds, always in the plural. Second one's about self-critique that doesn't paralyze action. Reaching towards deep time's complexity will, in Marilyn Strathern's terms, always leave remainders in analysis. Remainders can always elicit more analysis, which leave more remainders, which elicit more remainders, which elicit more analysis and more remainders, and it can go on forever. There's always more of deep time to know. However, cautiously applying these analytics of rationality to far futures can add some semblance of structure to your thoughts, and nothing more, nothing less. But this can at least help the safety case experts overcome the feelings of meaninglessness or mystery or terror that can well up when you gaze into deep time's abyss. But you can never really trick yourself into thinking this is a perfect representation of the future. There's always more of deep time to know. Its infinitions can never be fully lassoed into place. That's why another part of the rhetorical aspects of this, where they had a stepwise approach of progressively developing new, improved, hopefully improved, updated versions of the safety case that ideally grow more robust over the years. They call them iterations. So each safety case that's produced is kind of a work in progress. That's how the pitch is made. So new iterations are released every 10 or 15 years until the repositories plan decommissioning around the year 2120. So the first version of safety analysis was 1985. They released one in 92, 99. The one I was studying was to be submitted in 2013. Now they're working on an operating license safety case. That's the end of this year, maybe early next year if it goes into it. And then all the way up to the year 2120, supposedly higher res versions of far future Finland to be included in these. So a third reckoning is about multiple lines of reasoning, convening several different experts with several different disciplinary backgrounds to produce a vision of the future that's what Adrian Curie calls methodologically omnivorous. The other rhetorical dimension of the safety case is kind of a pitch like if readers don't trust the quantitative models of the far future ecosystems or hydrogeology, well, just turn the pages to the defense of the repository's engineered barrier system. If you don't believe the engineers, go to this page on this other section on mechanical stress testing done, where they try to break the copper canisters and show that they don't break easily. And if you don't trust those, they say, okay, now go to the qualitative scenarios where we detail far future worlds in this almost sci-fi like prose. So they thought it's an approach of what could be called strategic redundancy, right? Taking many different fields to ensure one potentially inaccurate assumption doesn't invalidate the wider range of projections, and it speaks to multiple audiences because different people with different epistemic sensibilities gravitate towards different sections of the safety case. So to me, this multi-perspectival form of interdisciplinarity and infinition is kind of a refreshing counterpoint, however reductive it may be. It's radically reductive, but it's a counterpoint to the myopic scientism that produced many of the intractable problems of the Anthropocene. We can see this by looking to another line of reasoning in the safety case, how analogies were used. Safety case experts studied a glacial ice sheet in Kongerlussuaq, Greenland as an analog, present-day stand-in feature used for comparison to make rough inferences about the far future of a glacial ice sheet in Finland during the next ice age. They studied a Mesozoic copper deposit that's been preserved for 170 million years, encased in mudstone in Devon, England. This becomes an analog for the repository's copper nuclear waste canisters. They study Lake Lappajärvi, a lake that resulted from a meteor crashing into Finland 73 million years ago, approach it as an analog for how Finland's landscape could change over the next several ice ages. Yet my informants didn't apply analogical reasoning to geophysical features alone. They also used archaeological artifacts. This gets weird here. They have this 2,100-year-old human cadaver from China that was found surrounded by clay, discovered along wood, vegetables, silk, and meat. That one's not in Finland. This is something that's been studied from afar. They were interested in the clay's capacity to preserve the bodies and the artifacts. They say, okay, the clay is well preserved, its abdominal organs are still intact, its skin's still there, its joints can still move, it wasn't even mummified. Vegetables and meat near it are only partially decomposed because this clay made an airtight seal around them. So they say, okay, how can we recast the cadaver and artifacts as analogs for how bentonite clay can preserve nuclear waste canisters over thousands of years? And there's big problems with this because watching the analogical politics and kind of the bickering that goes on in the office is interesting too, because there's differences between a cadaver and a nuclear waste canister. The latter is hot for millennia and the former is not. So they're not perfect copies of each other, and watching them say what is a valid analogy or not, is a point of contention. So they also look at this bronze cannon from the shipwrecked Swedish warship Kronen, submerged for almost 3 centuries in Baltic seawater and seabed. They study that as an analog for Finland's and Sweden's copper nuclear waste canisters. They also looked at 2,000-year-old Roman nails. They're dug up in Scotland and then pitched them as analogs for determining whether nuclear waste canisters' cast iron inserts are going to corrode in the future. So in my book, I'm like, okay, I'm going to follow these analogies across time and see where they take me. To go on an analogical journey, takes pit stops in the Roman Empire, future Earth that looks like Mars, everything's dead. Gabon during our planet's early history, goes to other planets. In ancient China, they're making analogies, regions of South Africa in the year 2030, West Virginia during World War II, in the mountains, Seneca Rocks. And I compare these nuclear waste analog studies in Finland to various climate analog and space analog studies, which are kind of analogous kinds of studies, if you will, that NASA's conducted. And I write about their limitations too, right? So there's certainly limits to what a bronze cannon submerged in the sea for centuries can really tell us about a nuclear waste canister buried in granite bedrock for millennia. There's major limits to what native copper found in mud rock in Devon, England can really tell us about a manufactured copper canister found in clay in Olkiluoto. So there's differences between repository components and their analogs, and sometimes they're too vast to make reasonable analogies between them. One informant noted how safety case experts tended to cherry pick analogs to support their own arguments. No safety case expert is scanning the world for counterexamples that could call the repository concept into question. I'll add to that that all of the things that have corroded across deep time are no longer here because they've already corroded. So your sampling size of artifacts to pick from are already things that have survived for millennia anyway. So there's problems with it, but this reflexive, multi-perspectival, multidisciplinary sensibility is still somewhat interesting and powerful, I think. It allows one to develop kind of a comfort with the infinitions of deep time and radical ambiguities and uncertainties by engaging with it, right? So analogs have something to teach us. It's never close to certainty, but they do offer this empirical concreteness or materiality that's at least a little more tangible than empty speculation about the future. So inspired by them sort of, but also keeping the limitations in view, I ask, what if more people were to integrate far-sighted flights of analogy into their day-to-day ponderings? Could it help wider populations sharpen short-sighted societies' deep time reckoning skills? Can doing routine intellectual exercises comparing different objects across time and space help wider publics reflect on possible similarities and differences between past, future, present-day worlds? To what extent can they help people speculate about what their home regions might look like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years from now? So this is approaching analogs as what Gabriel Hecht calls interscalar vehicles. They're kind of objects that you can follow the object biography of and then help us move through deep time and human time or through geological and political space all at once. So Hecht's concept of interscalar vehicles is a means for connecting stories and timescales that are usually held apart in the way we frame things. So I tried to do this myself as an example of some of the reckonings when I was working in Washington, DC. Now I'm in Vancouver. That's a different story, but I tried to follow objects analogically across time there too, kind of mimicking the patterns of reasoning of my informants. So 1922, excavators are clearing ground for this Mayflower hotel they're building. They find these fossilized bald cypress trees 20 feet below the surface. They live to be 1,700 years old. And they've grown roughly 100,000 years ago. Back then, America's capital city was a literal swamp. And today, 4 bald cypress trees planted in the mid-1800s grow right near the White House. I walk by them. They become interscalar vehicles. They become these kind of empirical analogical resources I can draw upon to help me think more widely across time. And they give me these like ancient tree imageries I can envision when reimagining the US capital city as a prehistoric marshland. So that's just one example. I also like hiking through Virginia's Appalachian Mountains and rolling hills, but hundreds of millions of years ago, this region was home to much taller mountains. Some say their elevations rivaled that of the Alps, the Rockies, the Himalayas. So when I hike, I try to use these analogical techniques to reimagine my surroundings as what the taller mountain ranges look like today, because I have imageries in my head of much taller mountain ranges. So it's about making analogies at the level of everyday experience and sort of stretching the momentary now or denaturalizing the now of your hike or your walk through town by situating in wider histories and futures, right? So in my book, I say, reader, maybe ask something like, if climate scientists forecast my current place of residence to look like a desert ecosystem, perhaps draw from your mental images of Arizona's deserts today and then reimagine the area with that ecosystem. If the area I live in is supposed to forecasted by climate scientists to look like Ice Age Finland someday, well, draw upon imageries of Greenland's Congerlussuaq glacial ice sheet as an analog for that. There's an app for this actually. It's not a very helpful app, but CGIAR tried this, climate analogs application, and it compares your home region's current climate to analogous regions' future climates. So when we add new analogs to our inventories and collect them, we get better at making good analogies and then also better at breaking bad analogies. And this long-termist outlook can be taken anywhere by anyone. But when doing these sort of exercises, we always have to ask, at what point do the dissimilarities between the two objects become so pronounced that they break the analogical tie between them? At what point do they cease to shed any meaningful light on one another? What degree of sameness between the objects and what kinds of sameness between the objects have to be present to break or make an analogical connection across time? So if an analogy is imperfect, it can still add some value, I argue. At least some useful information can be extracted from it in helping us refine how we distance ourselves from the now and envision these kind of plural futures as this ecological crisis takes hold. So what it can provide is an evidence-driven toolkit that's more tangible than navel-gazing speculation, but it is ultimately a work of total imagination. If entire populations were to start embracing skill sets like these, well, maybe a more long-sighted society could emerge. But remember, Deep Time Reckoning is at its core a work of ethnography. The book introduces the reader to several experts in person: Risto, Laura, Taimi, Juha, Anders, Apo, and Gustav. Most of the reckonings are positive, but some are cautionary tales. The last chapter is about how the safety case was thrown off course for months in 2005 when a prolific but also abrasive key expert died unexpectedly. I renamed him Seppo as a pseudonym. And during fieldwork, I tracked how safety case experts kind of summoned memories of Seppo, whose specter was said to haunt their community still, not literally, but figuratively haunt their community. So for some, the afterlives of his expertise are these gaps in knowledge left behind by an expert reluctant to document how he did his modeling work. Other times it's stories about how irritable he was or how chill he was during sauna nights, but how nasty he was at work. People are asking questions like, what would Seppo do while troubleshooting? And this chapter is about how challenging it can be to build intellectual infrastructures that outlast any particular lifespan. Let's see, since I'm running out of time, let's see, okay. So all of this is a response to a current crisis of time reckoning, right? Last year, the Trump administration advanced a proposal to reform key National Environmental Policy Act regulations to read, quote, effects shouldn't be considered significant if they're remote in time, geographically remote, or the product of a lengthy causal chain. That type of thinking makes Seppo's and the safety case experts' efforts to protect distant futures seem truly alien. I think over here in the US, we can find some hope in Joe Biden's electoral successes, but I don't think a simple change in a presidential administration will really help escape the toxic attentional economy that many find themselves in. The country is mired in a societal fixation on these knee-jerk social media culture wars, these frenzied 24-hour cable news cycles, short-sighted productivity metrics and audits, and unpredictable shifts in shareholder returns. Yet, due to the Anthropocene, deep time can no longer be the province solely of geologists, evolutionary biologists, archaeologists, theologians, and astrophysicists. It's a collective responsibility. So, as we move forward, the insights of long-sighted experts like the safety case experts will be essential. Unfortunately, though, as US enthusiasm for liberal arts education and scientific expertise deflates, intellectual communities are routinely written off by publics as just another out-of-touch clique. They're just another elite worth brushing off. And my hope is that deep time reckoning can help escape this bind while also resisting this shallow time discipline imposed by these kind of political, ecological, and epistemic crises. I went over, so I'm just gonna stop right now. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to your questions.